Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur ki jai. Srila Gadadhara Pandita ki jai. So, should I begin? Now or never? Hridayananda, the original, was a devotee in the line of Gadadhar Pandit, as we find in the Chaitanya Charitamrita. And of course, he represents in the Pancha Tattva the internal potency of Krishna. Gadadhara. Gada means club, and dhara holding. So Gadadhara, Krishna who holds the club to protect his devotees and defeat evil in the world. So Gadadhar Pandit, as we know, is a great devotee of Lord Krishna. Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur is an acharya of extraordinary historical importance. So I'd like to explain something about that. Scholars, academic scholars who have studied the history of the Gaudiya Vaishnava movement, from beginning with the time of Lord Chaitanya, have noted one unusual fact about the first century or two of Gaudiya history. That is that compared to other new religious movements, there was a remarkable lack of a formal administrative structure. The movement was powerful, it was united, it had an extraordinary, what's that? Oh, it had an extraordinary impact on Indian history. For example, secular scholars have pointed out that the level of communal violence between Hindus and Muslims or between different castes dramatically decreased due to the influence of Lord Chaitanya's movement. So it actually had an extraordinary impact. At the same time, in my view, because there were so many great devotees, so many pure devotees, so many devotees who had personal association with Mahaprabhu, or who knew somebody who associated with Mahaprabhu, or knew somebody who had once associated with someone who had associated with Mahaprabhu. Aloha. So it was a powerful, united movement of great devotees. And I think probably because there were so many great devotees, they didn't need to be managed very much. There was an inverse ratio. I would say the less people are Krishna conscious, the more they need to be managed. And the more people are Brahminical, Brahmins don't need to be managed. They simply need to be informed, like, could you please do this or whatever. Brahmanas in the Vedic culture were not managed. They were simply informed if there was a need. So, as we know, I think it's not difficult to make a historical analysis as the generations passed and as Lord Chaitanya's movement distanced itself in time from these first generations that were so advanced, that were these great liberated souls, as you started to get, if you'll excuse the term, normal devotees. Okay, it rebooted here. I won't charge you for that service. So as you start to get more and more devotees who are not nitya siddhas, who are not great liberated souls, you combine these two factors, where you're starting to get, quote unquote, regular devotees. At the same time, there's not a legacy of institutional administration or institutional structure. And I think those two factors combined explain what we know to be true, that Lord Chaitanya's movement passed through a time of, you could say, hard times, when the movement was not so strong, when there were not so many devotees. That combination of the movement's no longer made up of these extraordinary souls, liberated souls, who did not leave an administrative structure because they didn't need one. So then you can talk about the dark ages of Lord Chaitanya's movement. Of course, there are great devotees. There's Baladev Vidyabhushan. There are always some great devotees, but there's not a powerful movement. Therefore, it looks very different. And at that time, a great personality appeared who effectively, for the first time in history, brought Lord Chaitanya's movement into the modern world. And that person is Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur is not merely the guru or the father of the guru of Prabhupada, which is itself very significant. But for the first time in the history of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, he created an institutional framework. He also, so that is his unique achievement. No one had done that before, to create an institutional framework. Another great thing he did, he was the first to, not to recognize, because Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself said, Prithivite ache jata nagarari gram, sarvatra prachar hoive mora nam, that my name will be glorified all over the earth, in every town and village. But no one had actually acted upon that. Because if you look at India at the time of Mahaprabhu, and let's say the generations, next 2 or 3 generations after that, the only way that Hindus could even travel, perhaps, was as merchants. It's not that, and so if they traveled, the countries surrounding them, the countries surrounding India, were Muslim countries, where if you preached, you would be summarily executed. So if we look geographically, what was the perimeter, you could say, of the area in which India had trade relations, commercial relations with neighboring countries, they were Muslim countries. They were Muslim countries in which there was no question of preaching. And if you got past the Muslim countries alive, then you were in Christian countries, which were no better, also fanatical, violent, and so on. So if you say, why didn't the early followers of Lord Chaitanya preach in other countries? The obvious question is, which countries? Which countries? So, because the notion of religious freedom didn't really exist. Didn't really exist. Although things were happening during the life of Lord Chaitanya that would lead to religious pluralism. And with religious pluralism, divide and conquer, with the ability to actually preach in other countries. And actually, Lord Chaitanya orchestrated these things. I mean, you can see that in the lead up to Lord Chaitanya's appearance, and then during his life and the immediate aftermath, the world underwent dramatic transformation, which made possible an international society for Krishna consciousness. So I'll just mention that briefly and then get back to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, because he's very much in that line. Something happened around approximately 30 or 40 years before Lord Chaitanya appeared, which changed everything. And that was the invention of the printing press. Because before the invention of the printing press, there was no such thing as intellectual freedom. It's not that people chose the religion they wanted. There was nothing like that. And so the invention of the printing press, and then something else happened while Lord Chaitanya was actually in the world. Two things happened while Lord Chaitanya was in the world that combined with the printing press to transform the world. One was the age of exploration. When Columbus sailed in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. In 1492, Lord Chaitanya was 6 years old. And Columbus was trying to get to East India. He didn't know there was a little obstacle in the way called the Western Hemisphere. But Columbus was actually trying to get to the place where Lord Chaitanya was. I mean, he didn't know it. I don't think we can attribute to him some kind of illumination or anything. But what happened is, with this age of exploration, the discovery of gold in the New World, and suddenly all of the European countries who had access to the Atlantic Ocean, which were England, France, Spain, and Portugal, all the countries that had direct access to the Atlantic Ocean realized that that was suddenly where their fortune lay. There was unlimited land, gold. There was unlimited opportunity. And so you could say, what's the significance of that? And the Europeans also, of course, went around Africa and to India. And the world was so ignorant at that time that everyone in Europe, including the Pope, believed that India was a Christian nation, because they had all of these hagiographies, these exaggerated biographies of saints. And everyone in Europe was convinced that one of the apostles of Jesus was so powerful that he went to India and converted everyone. So when Vasco da Gama, who was the first European to reach India, at least in the modern period, he landed. That's why, of course, that's a Portuguese name, Vasco da Gama. And that's why they speak Portuguese in Goa, because that's where he landed, basically, in that region. And so they found a temple to a goddess, and they assumed, because they believed that India was a Christian nation, they believed it was a temple to the Virgin Mary. And so Vasco da Gama, and by the way, the Renaissance had not reached Portugal. If you know Europe, Portugal is the end of the line. And so whatever culture, whatever, in philosophy had reached Italy and other countries, it didn't make it to Portugal. They were kind of brutes. So they began to worship in this temple, thinking it was the Virgin Mary. Then they found out it wasn't the Virgin Mary, it was Durga. So they responded in a very pious way and started killing everyone and destroyed the temple. Interesting that at that time, one remarkable thing about India at that time, hope you don't mind all this information, put it in historical context. One I find remarkable thing about India was that, unlike Europe and other parts of the world, the Indian civilization, even under the Muslims, had very little interest in the coasts, the east and west coast of India, for the simple reason that India was such a wealthy country. It had something like 35 to 40% of all the wealth in the world. Wealth in that time being measured by precious stones, gold, agricultural products, textiles. India was by far by far the wealthiest country in the world. In fact, even centuries before that, Rome, the Roman Empire, had trouble with India because it was a balance of trade deficit, because India had lots of things Rome wanted, and basically Rome didn't have anything that India wanted or needed. So India was this very wealthy country, but it was all sort of internal domestic consumption. They didn't need foreign trade because of the wealth they had. The basis of wealth in those days also is agriculture. If you look at a river map of India, India has by far, the best system of natural irrigation in the world. It also has every climate from the Arctic regions of the Himalayas to tropical jungles and everything in between. So Vasco da Gama, quote unquote, discovered India. And that's why the Europeans just established cities on the coast, because they want to trade. So Calcutta, Chennai, Bombay, now Mumbai, all these Europeans were interested in the coast because they wanted to do trade. Anyway, so suddenly Europe was discovering the world, and you had the printing press. So there was this huge fad, or more than a fad, this huge new thing in Europe, which was travel literature. Travel literature. That suddenly, with the printing press, the level of literacy rose dramatically, and Europeans could now read about the world, which they'd never done before. No one had any idea what the world was. And so, inevitably, with this new, literally, cosmopolitanism, it's just like, why is New York City more liberal than, let's say, I don't know, Des Moines, Iowa? Because they have much more contact with the world, which relativized why is Mumbai so much more liberal than some little farming village in Madhya Pradesh? Why? Because when you have contact with many different cultures, many different religions, inevitably thinking people develop a more relative view of their own culture. Instead of being chauvinistic and fanatic, they become literally cosmopolitan. So that started happening. Europe started becoming more cosmopolitan. And then, during the time that Lord Chaitanya was alive on the earth, something happened which changed everything and made possible an international society for Krishna consciousness. And that was the Protestant Reformation, the democratizing of theology. Before the Protestant Reformation, there was one religion in Europe. Of course, they had the Eastern Orthodox, but that was Eastern Europe, which had very little contact with the world. But in terms of, England, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, all these countries, there was just one religion. So with the Protestant Reformation, suddenly you have the democratization of religion, democratization of theology. And because religion was the highest, just like in the European Varna system, the next thing to become democratized was the political system. It wasn't on. So, okay, so if it was muted, you can go to my website and find the unmuted version. And the second day in a row, they forget to unmute the, anyway. So, so divide and conquer. Without the Protestant Reformation and the dividing of Europe into many different religions and theologies, it was unimaginable there could be an ISKCON movement in the Western world. In fact, America was founded by people who wanted religious freedom, who wanted freedom to follow their own religion. That's why they founded America. So, so all these things were happening. These, at least the seeds or the early stages of all these things took place when Lord Chaitanya was on the earth. The invention of the printing press, the discovery of the world, the cosmopolitizing of the world, new religions, the democratizing of religion. And of course, then it went down to anyway, this democratizing, then next step was the Vaishya level, which was the French Revolution, and then the democratizing of Shudras, which was the Marxist Revolution. But I'm not going to go into all that now. But in any case, Bhaktivinoda Thakur was born into this very extraordinary world where England was not only just exploiting India, but also building universities. And bringing to India science and modern science and applied science, which was the Industrial Revolution. There was a scientific revolution in the 1600s, and then the applied science, when you take all this science and use it to actually produce things, it's called the Industrial Revolution. So, and in British India, as long as one was not politically subversive, there was freedom of speech, there was freedom of religion, and there were debates going on. Now, at this time, now we get even more specifically into Bhaktivinoda Thakur and his precise social role and historical role in his time. Because unlike the Muslims, who basically just brought mayhem, the British actually brought science, they brought great universities, this rigorous philosophical system. So what happened is that a lot of the most intelligent young Hindus were seduced by this and began to think that their own culture was primitive, superstition, unscientific. And they were attracted by this powerful Western rationalism, science, and so on, philosophy. And so there was some alarm in India among the older generations that we're going to lose our intelligent youth. And so there were various reactions to this. For example, the Arya Samaj and there are all kinds of organizations formed in India in the 19th century that were trying to make Hinduism and Indian culture more attractive for intelligent young Indians. And for example, the Arya Samaj, where they accept the Vedas or the Upanishads, but not the Puranas. Why? Because the Europeans made a criticism that the Upanishads are interesting because it's sort of sophisticated theology and it's, or the Vedas, but the Puranas are hopeless. All these stories about monsters and fairies and all these creatures flying around. So for them, for the Europeans and for the Americans, people like Thoreau and Emerson, the Shruti literature, the Upanishads were fascinating. Schopenhauer also, but the Puranas were hopeless mythology. So a group of people trying to fight back against Western influence formed this Arya Samaj, which accepted the Vedas, but not the Puranas. In other words, they bought into this story coming from Europe, and so redefined Hinduism as, it's really about the Upanishads and the Puranas, or we don't need that. So you see all these different attempts to counter Western influence. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was right in the middle of this. In fact, if you read English literature, 19th century English literature, they had a term which was good society. Good society meant basically you're not a Shudra, you speak English properly, and you're a respectable person. You're not just a lower class Shudra or a crude Vaishya, but actually you're an educated, respectable person. So educated, respectable people, they called good society. And so in India, because the capital of the British presence in India was Calcutta, and Calcutta was the intellectual center of India among Indians. And so they literally translated this term, good society, which in Sanskritic Bengali was Bhadralok. which means good society. Bhaktivinoda was in that group. That's the group that Bhaktivinoda Thakur belonged to. In fact, he even is recorded in history as one of the prominent people in that group. So that's who Bhaktivinoda Thakur was from looking from outside, like where did he fit in the social structure? And he admits in some of his writings that he was one of the intelligent young Bengalis seduced by Western culture. He too began to think that these literatures like Puranas were mythology, and that we have to be modern, we have to be scientific. I mean, imagine if someone grows up in somewhere in Mississippi, fanatical, born again, Christian family, basically, not really that educated, not, poor, uneducated, living very simply, and, having revivals, hooping and hollering, or snake handlers. And then, the son from that family, let's say, gets a scholarship to Harvard. And he goes there and he looks back at his little town in Mississippi and thinks, Jesus Christ. He thinks that, it's a great embarrassment. It's a great embarrassment. That's exactly the community that Bhaktivinoda Thakur belonged to. Highly educated, sophisticated culturally, and embarrassed about the poor, just the poor Hindu society, which, dressed in these very simple clothes and had all kinds of superstitions and mythologies about weird creatures inhabiting the universe, and was not at all scientific. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur begins from that point of view at a certain age. And then he discovered the Bhagavatam. He discovered the Bhagavatam. And he realized that the Bhagavatam is, even from the literary or theological point of view, it was as sophisticated or more sophisticated than anything coming from the West. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur had this very powerful experience in which he realizes, boy, I was really foolish. And he then dedicates his life to showing the world the real glory of India. The Bhagavatam, Krishna, Vaishnavism, that becomes his life's mission. To help other people understand what he understood. And, but he's not sectarian. He's not like, he doesn't go woke. Like suddenly, the Western Europeans are evil and, he doesn't become a fool. He doesn't, not only does he not feel animosity toward the West, but he becomes inspired to enlighten the West. One time I was walking with Prabhupada, and in those days, for sort of obvious psychological reasons, the devotees, there was this little cottage industry among the young devotees to denigrate the West. And this, of course, you can understand the reason why the West is so degraded, the West is so bad. The reason is obvious, it's psychological, not philosophical. And that is that if you study the psychology of marginalized communities that are considered to be outside respectable society, like ISKCON was in those days, for two reasons. Number one, we were young, and there was a great generation gap, so that, adults didn't trust young people because they were too crazy. They were, doing all kinds of radical, crazy things, free sex, drugs, burning American flags. And of course, they were doing these things, and the older generations had gone through World War II. They had gone through World War II. I was born 3 years after the end of World War II. And America was just filled with patriotism because of what lost the war, we would have all been killed or enslaved. So for this generation, which was patriotic, which grew up during the Great Depression, World War II, they saw their children burning flags and cursing the country. It was a big problem. Bhaktivinoda Swami knows all about this, same generation. So therefore, there was what was called then a generation gap. The young people said, don't trust anyone over 30. And of course, everyone else said, don't trust anyone under 30. And so because we were young, because we were exotic and strange, and we convinced probably a very large percentage of the American people that we were crazy by the way we presented ourselves in these exotic costumes. So we self-marginalize. Prabhupada said, there are quotes from Prabhupada saying, he was asked why, the Brahmachari asked Prabhupada, this is in Veda-based, you can read it, I'm not making this up. The Brahmachari asked Prabhupada, why do we dress in these clothes, Indian clothes? And Prabhupada said, because you wanted to. I never said you had to do it. So anyway, so we were a marginal community. And when you live in a marginal, sequestered sort of community where you don't really deal very much with the outside world, you develop certain attitudes. One typical psychology of marginalized communities is that in order to sort of keep their mental health, just like, for example, the body, there's all these reflexes in the body to protect itself. They're not even conscious. Like sometimes if you touch a hot surface, your hand pulls away before you actually realize that you touched something hot. Or for example, if someone is sort of menacing you, your hands go up. So there's all these automatic physical reflexes by which the body protects itself. There are also automatic mental reflexes by which the nervous system, the mind protects itself. So when because if you perceive that you belong to a group that is marginal, that is not accepted by society, there's a very primitive instinct, because in the animal community, if you are rejected by the herd or rejected by your group, you'll probably die. It's very likely you will die. And so there's something menacing at a very deep neurological level about being marginalized. And so therefore, the typical response to that marginalization is that you marginalize the people who marginalize you. So devotees felt this strong need to denigrate Western culture. They felt it was sort of like this unconscious psychological need to denigrate Western culture and to glorify everything that came from South Asia, even if it had nothing to do with Vaishnava culture. So if you went to a home program, for example, a lady or a man, you didn't have to wear what ISKCON describes as devotional dress, but you did have to wear something Indian. It could be a Punjabi, it could be, this or that. And even if it was Muslim, it just had to be Indian. Why? Because when devotees went to India, they were treated like conquering heroes. In India, because they have this higher culture, because they have this awareness of Krishna, the response, the treatment of devotees in India was exactly the opposite of the West. Whereas in the West, we were, bullied and looked upon as something weird and crazy. In India, it was exactly the opposite. So psychologically, the devotees embraced everything Indian, Vaishnava or not, and felt a need to denigrate the West. So an example of this, and I just wanted to give a bit of a background, because I said it's psychological, it's not philosophical. So one time we were walking with Prabhupada in Rancho Park in Los Angeles, which was the park of my youth and childhood, which was amazing, walking with Prabhupada past the tennis courts, the Little League baseball diamonds. So we were walking with Prabhupada, and so one brahmachari was, it was kind of like this thing that the young devotees would do. They would always, because for most of the devotees in ISKCON, the morning walks were practically the only chance they had in their life to speak to Prabhupada. The movement grew so fast, it was impossible for Prabhupada to speak with everyone. And so in the morning walk, that was their one chance to actually have a personal contact with Prabhupada. And so one common thing was the devotees would bring to Prabhupada's attention all the latest evidence of the utter deprivation and degradation of the Western world in Kali Yuga. Because it was like, the more you can denigrate the West, the more their rejection of ISKCON is powerless, and the more necessary we are. So, for example, I mean, I've heard Sunday feast classes where the devotees say, yes, and in America, the crime is increasing every day, at a time when crime was actually decreasing every day. It didn't matter. That was the narrative. So anyway, we were walking with Prabhupada one time, and this sort of brahmachari came up and said, Prabhupada, you know, he was a book distributor. Prabhupada, the Americans are so demonic and they're so materialistic. And Prabhupada stopped him and said, no. He said, they're not bad. They're good people. They're simply, you just have to teach them. So here you had this interesting thing, because as we know, so many crimes and even, let's say, murders are crimes of passion. And so civil wars are often the most vicious, or in a family when people in the same family turn against each other. So when young American devotees felt rejected and denigrated by their own country, they responded with this violent criticism, and everything Western was bad. So it's interesting, actually. But getting back to Bhaktivinoda Thakur, I wanted to explain all that because Bhaktivinoda Thakur was obviously not a neophyte. He was an eternally liberated soul. And so Bhaktivinoda Thakur, even though he was responding to the Western or British attempt to not only politically, militarily, and economically colonize India, but also to in the religious sense, to colonize India and to make it a Christian country. In fact, the standard Sanskrit English dictionary that we all use by Monier Williams, who wrote it about 120, 25 years ago at Oxford, and it was very popular, so they published the second edition in Oxford Press. And in the second edition, he has to defend himself from all the criticism he got for producing the most important Sanskrit English dictionary in the world. The criticism was that he held a chair, and this is during Bhaktivinoda's time. This is the culture during Bhaktivinoda's time. He held the Bowdoin chair. There was a Colonel Bowdoin, this British colonel, who endowed a Sanskrit chair at Oxford. But the terms of the endowment were that whatever scholar holds this Oxford chair has to do scholarship which helps to convert Hindus into Christians and helps to, helps in the process of westernizing, colonizing, and converting Hindus. And so because he did a dictionary, he was criticized, like, what good does the dictionary do? I mean, how many Christians are we going to make out of a dictionary? How's that going to help us to convert Hindus? This is Oxford. This is Oxford University at the time of Bhaktivinoda. So, and so he defends himself. If you look at the second edition of the Monier Williams Oxford English, Sanskrit English Dictionary, he says, look, if we know Sanskrit, we can translate the Bible into Sanskrit. And Hindus are so simple, they think anything written in Sanskrit is Shastra. Of course, which is not true. For example, we would never find in ISKCON that thousands of devotees think that Vastu is Shastra just because it's a book written in Sanskrit and no one has any idea who wrote it or when, right? I mean, that would never be the case. That just because it's an old Sanskrit book, thousands of devotees think it's authoritative. Anyway, moving on. And he also said that we can translate the Sanskrit Shastras into English and show how silly they are and how inferior to Christianity. I mean, I don't know if he really meant that. I think he was just saying what he had to say to save his neck. But that shows the atmosphere. So what's interesting, and of course, there were many British people who were not so bigoted and stupid. There were also many British who were fascinated by Vedic culture. So it's a very interesting time. Among the British and among the Hindus, you had people on both sides. There were Hindus that went to London and thought, I'm never going back to India. And there were British people that went to India and said, I'm never going back to England. So, I mean, there were majority positions, but all of it was going on. It was an incredibly interesting time in history. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur was right in the middle of all of this. Right in the middle of it. And ultimately, he dedicated his life. It was Bhaktivinoda Thakur that first had the vision that Lord Chaitanya's movement is meant for the whole world. It's not just meant for India, and certainly not just meant for Hindus. It's meant for the world. This is a world religion. That was Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And he understood that in this age, we have to institutionalize. There has to be a legal institutional structure. There have to be directors. There has to be definitely bylaws. It was Bhaktivinoda Thakur that, because anyway, so he was the one that brought Lord Chaitanya's movement intellectually and administratively into the modern world. And as we know, he sent books to Western universities, and he inspired his son, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and they worked together. And then Bhaktisiddhanta took it to the next stage. Because what Bhaktisiddhanta added was ashram, brahmacharis, sannyasis, a more, you could say, mobilized, more directly, powerful preaching mission with full-time preachers. Then, of course, Prabhupada obviously took it to the next stage. So Bhaktivinoda is definitely one of my greatest heroes in Krishna consciousness, and very learned. I mean, he wrote serious poetry in 3 languages. I would say probably, probably at least 95% of the people in this world cannot write serious poetry in 1 language. Although a lot of people think they are writing serious poetry and they punch the world with their stanzas. So Bhaktivinoda Thakur actually wrote serious poetry in 3 languages. He was brilliant. He had a heart of gold, as they say. If you hear his songs, his profound humility, his profound compassion, clearly a soul absolutely free of false ego. Absolutely, to have all these qualifications, to be a magistrate, a judge under the British, highly educated. He had resources. He was not poor, highly respected in society, a great acharya, and yet incredibly humble. Incredibly humble. And so that's Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And Krishna West, which, my latest nefarious deviation in the Hare Krishna movement, Krishna West is it's obviously inspired by these great acharyas, So perhaps I'll stop there and see if there are any questions on these points. Okay, don't all ask at once. Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be able to associate with all of you and discuss the glories. Yes. Oh, let's stick to the topic here, perhaps. Well, I had the darshan of Radha Damodar almost 50 years ago. Not 50, but maybe less than 40. I mean, at least 45 years ago. When they were being worshipped by Vishnu Swami, who was a very special soul. So he had them on the bus. In fact, that was a Radha Damodar traveling party, which was, they became the champions of Sankirtan. It was the greatest preaching force practically in the Western world, the Radha Damodar party. And so it seems wherever Radha Damodar stay, they inspire amazing projects. Here we are on the only working farm, actually in the Western Hemisphere, not only in North America, maybe in the Western world. I don't know. Working farms are in Europe, but in this community, I have to say it's a very sublime community. I was telling Bhaktivinoda Swami, and I'm not just being diplomatic because I trust that even if I'm not diplomatic, he'll still feed me. But actually, it is an extraordinary community, and very nice with just the quality of the interaction between the devotees, which is a real measurement. Also, this is not insignificant, the paved roads. That's it's really, I feel like, oh my God, civilization. So it really is, it's a beautiful project with very nice, loving devotees. And again, under the watchful eye of Radha Damodar. So it seems like Radha Damodar have an extraordinary power to inspire important devotional service. So I'll say that. Yes. Yes. Or what? Yes, psychological. I don't really know about his previous life that much before he received. I mean, most of the great vast majority of devotees in the Western world were meat eaters before they came to Chaitanya. Of course, we're not on the level of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, but I don't know the details. I don't know the details, and but he certainly manifested himself as a great attorney. I don't know. I don't know the study that much. About what? Well, for example, when I was a young devotee, it was very common. Every time I walked down the street, people would, ridicule me or curse me, or or they um, offered to me some typical mudras. And also, it was very common that we would want to rent a house for a temple, and they wouldn't rent it to us because we were devotees. And so it was basically, I mean, as soon as you walked out the door, you were ridiculed. People staring at you, thinking you were crazy. And that takes its toll psychologically. It takes its toll psychologically. Actually, there's one moment, the Philadelphia Rock Theatre, I think it was 75 or 76, Prabhupada was there. 75? Oh, thank you. 1975. And so I was watching an interview with Prabhupada on what I call ISKCON, or Prabhupada C-SPAN. It was just sort of all the unedited footage that exists of Prabhupada video footage. And so a young reporter was interviewing Prabhupada, a young lady. And it was very clear from the context, the way she was introduced to Prabhupada, that she was a friend of the movement. She was actually a friend of the movement. And she was doing the interview in an attempt to help the movement. And she asked Prabhupada a question which Prabhupada didn't really understand the question. I mean, that happened a lot. If you look at Prabhupada being interviewed by, let's say, American media, where the reporter will ask Prabhupada something and he doesn't quite understand what the question is getting at, and then Prabhupada will answer, and the reporter is not quite clear what Prabhupada said. So that was somewhat common. And so this reporter, this young lady, asked a question which Prabhupada didn't respond to. Just somehow they just weren't connecting on that question. So she respectfully went to another question. When I heard the question, it was like ding, 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 ding. All these bells were going off in my head. And the question was, she said that Prabhupada, every day your disciples are going out in public, and the public is responding very negatively to them. Do you think that over time, this is going to have a negative effect on your disciples? This constant negativity. So as I said, Prabhupada somehow just didn't really communicate. So when I heard that question, I just thought, oh my God, that's me. And there are different kinds of people. There are different kinds of people with different psychologies. I mean, some people, their comfort zone in society is to be a freak. I mean, they do everything humanly possible in terms of body art, piercing, the way they dress, or platinum blue hair. They that's their comfort zone. They want they want to be freaks in society, and so they that's what the life. But most people aren't like that. Most people, I know I'm certainly not like that, and I wasn't brought up that way. And so for me, I could see that over time it was actually damaging to spend so many years of my youth being a freak in society, being even physically attacked, being discriminated against, being ridiculed, basically on a daily basis. And I could see that it took a toll. And that's why, I mean, I'm happy to dress like this and geez, but that's why in my regular life, I just personally, this is like a confession. I came to a point where I can't be a freak anymore for anyone. And I found that when I presented myself in the world as a more normal person, normal people were happy to listen to me and to learn about Krishna. And of course, eventually led to Krishna West. So I'm not trying to dictate to everybody what they have to do, but that's my life. And then I discovered that there are innumerable quotes from Prabhupada supporting my thinking. There's a misconception among many people that Prabhupada was this very conservative person. And so there is a very conservative Prabhupada that very conservative devotees have created their own image. But the real Prabhupada was actually very liberal. I mean, he was very conservative about certain things. He would not, there are basically three things on which Prabhupada would never compromise, which are our philosophy. He would never compromise on philosophy. Oh, see, Radha Damodar. Prabhupada would not compromise on philosophy. He would not compromise on our basic sadhana, our spiritual practice. And he would not compromise on our institutional framework. He wanted his followers to serve his mission, which was ISKCON. So if you are a faithful servant of ISKCON, and you are faithfully presenting Prabhupada's philosophy, and you are faithfully practicing Bhakti Yoga as he taught it, then Prabhupada really doesn't care about how you dress. And I could give you, as many quotes as you want, direct quotes from Prabhupada. And so, so Bhaktivinoda Thakur is the first great innovator. I mean, the first great innovator is Lord Chaitanya himself, who redefined Vedic culture. And, Lord Chaitanya took this huge, sprawling, so-called Vedic culture, and he said, this is the point, this is the philosophy, this is the practice for the sage. So the first great innovator was Lord Chaitanya, but then the first great innovator in the modern world is Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Prabhupada took it through, and then he took it to the next level. So if you look at the history of Vaishnavism, it is a history of adaptation. At the same time, preserving everything which is essential. Everything that is essential must be preserved without compromise, and everything which is just a devotional detail has to be adapted. A distinction made by Rupa Goswami in chapter 6 of the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, in which Prabhupada, of course, also teaches. Of course, it always has been. The fact that so many people aren't sure about that, I think, is a very telling commentary on the psychology of people in small scale societies where everyone kind of has to be a carbon copy of everyone else. I mean, the fact that, we could not have said more times that this is ISKCON. I mean, I think it would have been physically impossible to say that more times than we did. And we are constantly explaining there's an ISKCON project, it's a Prabhupada project, it's based strictly on Prabhupada's literal statements. And 10 or 12 years later, people are still asking that question. And so, of course, this phenomenon is very clearly explained in the social science of group behavior. So again, these things are not philosophical, they're sociological and psychological. Anyway, thank you all very much for your patience, and yes, it's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. I'd like to personally and publicly thank Devamrita Swami or for the extraordinary service he's doing, of course, Dhruva and Parijata and all the devotees here. It really is, I think, without question, one of the nicest communities in the Western world. So I hope I didn't get myself in too much trouble, and Hare Krishna.